So this is the scene in Cinema 4D, or some version of it. Anyway, there's a missing material here, but you can see it's a camera mapped scene, and of course you've got the actual balloons floating around in the scene as well. So we'll go through each of these elements, and hopefully you guys will learn some cool new stuff. Okay, so in a new project, I'm going to get a camera. This is going to be our starting point because we need to do some camera calibration for the camera mapping. Okay, in image, I'm going to load up my background plate, and this is it right here. And I need to match the aspect of the project to what the image is. So this was a 2561 by 3840. That's the original dimensions of the image. So now it matches the aspect of the project. Okay, in the calibration, we want to go to the Calibrate tab. And we need to just start by adding some lines. And the idea here is to find lines in the frame which are perpendicular to each other so that Cinema 4D can work out the geometry of the scene. So this is going to be my first line, just tracing this white edge over here. And by the way, I guess I should show you the original image, how that looked. And this is the final file, which I brought in all the layers after I did the rendering. But this was the original picture right here. And what I had to do was just take out some of the details in the picture, including the person. And when I cut them out, and also a cutout of just a person, these are the two layers which I use to construct the 3D scene. And then we bring it all back together later in Photoshop. Okay, so this is the background without the person there. It's just easier to work with. Okay, so the first line we placed here, I want to press Shift and click to map this as the X direction. Okay, we can add another line, and this will be running alongside this yellow rail you see in the back there. And I can press Shift and click that too to cycle through to the red line. You can continue cycling through the three different axis lines. We're starting with red, and because I know this is a straight line, and over here is another straight line, and they are parallel to each other. So that's how you set this up. Now we set up the perpendicular Z lines. So this time I'm going to cycle through to the blue line, which is the Z axis, and you need at least two in each direction before Cinema 4D can try to come up with some kind of solve. Okay, and this is the initial result. Now it's telling me that it thinks the resulting scene is going to have a focal length of 59 millimeter, and I know this is wrong because when I took the picture originally, I was using a 28 millimeter lens. So what I can try and do here is move these lines around and try to get closer to that number. So as I move this around, you can see that it does make a difference to this number right here, and it seems moving this line made the biggest difference. So we're down to 43 mil, which is still just too high. So I can try and make this as small as possible, this number right here. And our lines can extend beyond the frame as long as they're slicing through the right lines in the original image. So that's what I'm trying to do here. And it seems about 40 to 43 is the lowest I can get this to conform to. Okay, I can work with this, even though it's not entirely accurate. I think within the scene itself, it should be fine. Okay, something else I can do to help myself here is try and estimate some kind of scale for the scene. So I know that in the UK, parking spots are roughly 2.4 meters wide. So I can create another another red line here and get the right length for that. So if I click that again, I can take known length and set this to 240, and this will help with the general scale of the scene. Okay, and the last thing is we want to add a pin, which is this circle in the center of our frame, and move it to somewhere on the floor down here, and this is going to be the center of our scene. So 0, 0, 0 is going to be right there. Okay, that's fine. Now we can create a camera mapping tag and a background object, and if I move around, we have this kind of thing. Alright, so to attach the material to some geometry, we need a plane, and I'm gonna go to the width and height segments. Let's do 1 by 1. We don't need any more than that. But now I can take the camera mapping texture tag and either just drag it to the plane, or I can make a copy, and it's the same thing. And now you see we have some geometry with the material attached to this. Okay, this looks great. I can hit C to make it editable, and let's grab these edges. So in edge mode, I'm going to take this line first of all and move it back into Z space up until the point where I start to hit this unit you see back here. So that's where this dark pixels start to come in, and it's quite hard to see what's going on, so we can go to the materials and increase the preview size to say 4K. Bit easier to see what's going on now. Okay, and I can raise this line up, so hold control and just drag upward, and we make an extrusion like this. And it's too far out this way, so I can take this and just pull it back in, and then taking this line alone, and again hold control and extrude out to the edge, this time going to about where this barrier starts to creep in. So the darker pixels, again about there, seems to be correct. And I can also take this line right here, and let's extrude this out this way. We won't really see this part of the frame, but let's just make sure we have the geometry for that too. And I can take the point here and bring this in like this. So some fairly rough geometry approximating roughly what the scene was like originally. Okay, now we can also bring in a proxy of the person. So if I get a plane, let's make it a Z plane, and you can see the perspective is a bit distorted and shifted, but that's fine. We can just make this smaller and make it taller like this. I don't think the kind of camera stuff I had this time was as good as my other ones I did before, so maybe once I set this section up, I can go back to one of those other projects and continue using one of those instead. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm gonna load up a texture of the cutout. So I think it's number 3, I'm not sure. Okay, I can copy the same image, put this in the alpha, and now we have our cutout. And again, let's just increase the resolution of the texture to 4K. Okay, this needs to be part of this camera mapping setup we did. So on the texture tag, let's change the projection to camera mapping, and we can drag the same camera into the camera link box over here. And then we need to calculate the aspect so that this displays correctly like this. And now I can move this plane forward toward the camera until we get the feet in the right position. So I think something like this here is correct. And we can use the shadow here to judge roughly where she should be standing. Okay, and now if I look through my camera, you see how the scene looks now. We have reconstructed a 3D version of our original photo. And the reason I have this cut out here is when I place the balloons in the scene, I want to make sure that they're not intersecting with the general area where she is standing. We want them kind of over and around her and then tailing off into the distance. So let's bring the balloons in, and I'm going to take these from another version of this project. So if I get this cloner and a spline, let's bring all of this into this new scene. And this is how this was set up. I just drew a spline cutting through the scene, and the way I did this was in the top view, I just went to the splines menu, and using the freehand sketch, I just drew a spline doing this kind of thing like this. So I need to zoom out, and just like that, just a you know, an approximation of what I had before. And in the perspective view, I can come in here now and lift these points up in Y space. So this kind of thing. Obviously, I spent more time adjusting how my spline looked, and you know, looking through the camera and making minor adjustments. I ended up with this other spline you see here. So I'm not going to repeat this section. I'm just going to continue on with this other older spline. So by default too, the clones will come in, and your spline is going to be adaptive, so they will be more concentrated in the areas where the spline is bending, where there are more segments there. So I have to change this to subdivided, and if I reset the cloner, we have some more evenly spaced clones. Okay, and inside of this, looking through the camera, I can go to effector and random, and let's make sure this is loaded into the cloner, and just playing with the position. So maybe something like 200 in X, about 100 in Y, and maybe 200 in Z as well. Just trying to create a random kind of look. And this is where you might go back to your spline and make some further adjustments. So right now it seems there aren't enough balloons around the person, so I might move this point a bit to the right and maybe bring it down as well, just trying to get more of the balloons in the frame. But in the random effector, you can also go to the seed and play around with that and try to get a different distribution of the balloons. And something like this might be interesting, except this is kind of blocking the person. So I could actually move that one balloon by itself. If I go to more graph selection, and this will reveal dots over your clones, I can select this, which creates a selection tag. And if I have this selected and let's say get a plane effector, the effector is going to have that selection loaded into this box right here, and it's only going to affect that one clone. So let's go to parameters and let's zero out everything, and now I can move this around however I want. Okay, so let's move it just away from the person and then maybe a bit lower, and also make the balloon smaller. So let's go maybe -0.3 for the scale. And I like this distribution better. I could maybe take the points on the spline in the distance here and just bring them back into the picture. Okay, and I think that's good enough. We will look at the material for this and the lighting later. What we want to do next is the strings that you saw attached to each balloon. So to do this, I want to get the cloner, and under MoGraph I want to get the tracer, and it's going to load up our cloner by default, so that's great. And the tracing mode I'm going to set to connect all objects, and this should draw a line running through every single clone starting with the first one, whichever one that is. So it looks like this black balloon right here, and it draws a line which goes through every single balloon all the way to the end. And the reason we do this is we can now attach some hairs to this tracer object. So if I click on the tracer and go to simulate and hair object and add some hair, by default the hair is going to attach to the vertices, which means the points along this line, and in this case the points run along through each clone. So if I hit play now, the hair is dynamic by default, so you now get these strings dangling from each balloon. And by the way, this is working in this case because the anchor point on my balloon is at the base of the balloon, so that's where the root is attached to. By default, most models or objects in Cinema 4D, the axis center is in the center of the object, so this string will be dangling from inside the balloon. So to make sure it attaches in the correct place, we have to go to the balloon model, and here is one example. You see my axis is in the right place. If it wasn't, I would go to the mesh and axis center, and this dialog box, I can command this to go down to the base. So by default it's in the center like this. If I go to the y-axis, set this to -100% and execute, it's going to snap to the lowest point on the model. Okay, so that's how you do that. And by the way, this balloon model is a free model from Turbo Squid, so along with the project files for this, I will provide a link to the original version of this. I made a change though using a taper deformer, where I just wanted to make the balloon a bit more rounded than before, and it's a taper deformer which is also upside down, and setting the strength to a negative control to make it more spherical like this. Okay, so that's how the balloon was done, and then just drop that inside of a cloner. Also by default it was a huge model, so I had to lower the scale to 0.3 in the transform tab, but this might be different for you depending on the general scale of your own scene. So that's just a quick breakdown of the balloon itself. Let's continue with these strings, and let's drop this down to 0.3 again. And if I go to the hair, first of all, the strings are like coming out, you know, sideways and then dropping down. So we want to go to the dynamics, and there's a control in here in properties called hold roots. Let's zero this out, and now if I hit play, it's going to drop properly instead of arching outward first. Okay, so that's great. Also, if you render, you're gonna see some hairs, and we don't want this. We want some real geometry. So the way I did my geometry was, first of all, if I go to the generate tab, untick render hairs, and then change the type from none to spline, and that's going to give you the splines like this. Still too many hairs, so we need to go to the hairs tab, and the roots need to be set to as guides, and now you will get a 1-to-1 ratio of the original guides to the actual hairs, so there won't be any excess hairs in between, like the render engine tries to do by default. So now that we have these splines, we can use the sweep Nurbs to generate the geometry. But I could have also done this inside of the hair itself directly. So if I go to generate again, maybe use something like a circle instead, and you get this kind of thing right here. But I'm going to use a different approach because I wanted a specific kind of a ribbon coming from the balloon. So changing this back to spline again, I'm going to go to the splines menu, and let's get a Helix Spline. I'm going to solo this by itself, and these are the settings I'm going to do for this. So the start radius is going to be set to 0, and the end radius is going to be about 3. And this needs to be going in an upward direction, so let's go XZ, and we have this kind of thing. And I can also go to the end angle, and let's set this to something like 1080, just so we have a bit more twisting going on. And this is going to be a rough shape for the ribbon which I wanted to be coming off each balloon. Okay, and what we do with this is I can spline wrap this onto each hair, and this is how you set this up. If I get the spline wrap deformer, attach this to the helix, and in the splines menu we're going to load up our hair here, and this will actually instance our helix onto each individual hair, but obviously right now it's doesn't look right. It's going in the wrong direction, so I have to go to axis, and let's set this to positive Y, and now if I hit play, you can see how this looks. It looks like we have two lines, but one is our guide and the other one is the actual other spline that we have here. So once we have this, we can attach, we can put this inside of a sweep Nurbs to generate the geometry. So I'm going to get a rectangle, and let's set the width to 0.1 and the height to 0.6. And again, just some numbers I used before, and I know they're going to work here as well. Okay, and we can take this and put this inside of a sweep, just like this. The scene slows down slightly because we now have all of this geometry being generated, but still quite responsive. And this is the reason I used this method for generating the geometry, because I wanted to use that helix to get the curly ribbon effect. Okay, we can jump back into our camera, and right now the ribbons just look too uniform, so we want to randomize them a bit more. And the way to do this is using the hair material itself. So I can jump into this, and we're not using any color from this, so we can turn this off, and specular as well, but we want to play with the length to begin with. Maybe drop this down to about 85%, and then have a variation of about 50% or so. So it means that these strings are going to have a different length. Now you see they've just all disappeared, and this is going to happen sometimes. You just have to go to the hair object and reset a few things, and I'm going to save before I do this first. In the guides tab, you want to go and regrow. I don't know the reason why it just disappears like that sometimes, but if it does, it's very easy to get back, just to regrow. And also, because of the way this is set up, and it's it's disappeared again, but because of the way this is set up, if you change the number of clones, for example, let's drop down to 80. If I go back into the hair, you're going to see the count of the roots has also dropped to 80. So this updates automatically when you change certain things. It's just that each time you do this, you have to go back to the hair and make sure you regrow and reroute your hairs so that they attach to the new positions. So it's quite simple and very procedural in the way that it's built. So let's go back to 100%. And if I happen to change the random effector, I would have to do the same thing. So go back to the hair and reroute. And if I play again, the hair will reattach to the correct positions. You can see this time the count didn't go up to 100. So that's a glitch which just happened. So we can try and fix this. Okay, so for some reason my hair would not reinitialize and reroute correctly, so I have undone to an earlier stage where I still just had 100 hairs and 100 guides. And again, if I just regrow, let's see, it seems to just kind of die each time. So regrow and reroute, and here we go. Yeah, so it's a bit unstable, I guess, in the way it operates, but if you undo or maybe just redo the setup, it should work again. Okay, before I move on to the lighting, I'm just going to make a few other adjustments. In the hair material, again, we can come in here and let's go to the frizz, and I'm gonna bring this in, and I'm gonna have it at 40% and the variation at 40% as well, and the kink similar numbers, so 50 and 50. And this is just going to twist and bend the strings here so that they just look a bit more random and not as uniform as before. So that's the effect of doing that. I can see in the distance that there are some instances where the strings are actually going through the ground. We may need to set up the floor here as a collider. So if I just click the plane for the floor, go to hair tags, I can load up a hair collider here. So now if those strings touch the ground, they're going to bounce off. Okay, we can do the lighting and rendering now, starting with the material for the balloons. Now it's all the same, so I'm just going to break down one of these for you. In the color channel, you set your color, so whatever you want that to be for each balloon. And then in the transparency, this was set to 40%, and this was the only thing I changed here, and then everything else was left to the default values. In Reflectance, there was a few layers stacked on top of each other. You've got the standard specular blin, and it's the blin old legacy version. Set the width to 60% and the fall off to -15, just to sharpen it slightly, and the strength to about 20. The next layer was another specular, this time using a GGX set to additive again, and the roughness is 20% and the strength was just 0.4, so just a small sharp highlight on top of the first one. And the last layer was a reflection layer, very faint reflection, just a strength of 11%, some slight blur at 7%, and also a Fresnel loaded into the color. And you will see the effects of this when we do some rendering shortly. And this was the same in each material besides just what was in each color. And then, in the cloner, you have as many balloons as you have colors. So one for each color. And when you do your cloning, everything's going to look multicolored like this. Okay, let's do the lighting. For this, I used a physical sky system. So if I go to the floors menu, let's get the physical sky. And the reason I used this was because I could go to the time and location controls and actually set this to be the same as when I took the picture. So this was last month in August, and it was around 2:30 p.m. during the day, so we can set that here. And the location I'm going to set to the city which I was in, which is in Europe, UK, and Manchester. And this is going to roughly approximate the kind of lighting situation I was in when I took the original picture. Now I don't want to see the sky, so I'm going to go to the basic tab and let's turn this off. And also in the sun controls, I'm going to put the intensity up to 150 just to make it really bright. And I can see here this is definitely pointing in the wrong direction, and that's just because of the default Z direction. It's going this way. So I would just have to take the sun here and rotate this about 90 degrees this way, something like this. And I can try to match it up to the shadow that this is casting here, so I can continue rotating this even more. And it seems about here would be correct. And we have the right angle in the sky because of the time and location settings here. So to test this, I can do a quick render and see how those shadows are going to appear. So no shadows. That's because this material on the floor, this camera mapping material, is loaded into the luminance by default. So let's remove that, put this in color, and then on the plane, let's attach a compositing tag, and in the tag settings, take compositing background, which is going to make this into just a matte. So when I hit render, it's only just going to catch the shadows, and now you see they are roughly in the correct position. Okay, we don't actually want to render the shadow for the person here, so let's put a tag on this and remove cast or receive shadows. And also, when I rendered this, it was not seen by the camera, but I left it there because I wanted some of the reflections to bounce off the balloons and maybe just get a bit more realism and detail that way. So now if I render, we only have the shadow of the balloons, which are too dark right now. So let's go to our camera first of all, and in the physical sky, I'm gonna go to the sun settings and let's put the density of the shadows to about 60%. And if I re-render, we get this kind of thing. Still too dark probably, but this was rendered as a multi-pass, so I can change the opacity later in Photoshop as well. Okay, I also used the global illumination for this. So if I go to Effect and GI, I was using irradiance cache in the primary method, and in the secondary it was light mapping. The maximum depth here was set to 8, which is just to try and speed things up. Samples were also set to low, and in the irradiance cache I came in here and lowered the settings even more, so go to low and then bring them down even further. And in light mapping, I dropped the path count to just 3000, and build radiosity maps ticked. And that was it for the GI settings. So if I run another render, we have this kind of thing. It's going to take longer obviously, but not too long overall. And something else happening right now is the strings, they don't have a material, and also they're just kind of flapping away in one direction. So what we have to do for these is, first of all, let's lengthen our timeline to say 10 seconds. And I'm gonna put some wind force into the scene. So if I go to simulate, I want to go to particles and let's get the wind. And it's this fan which you see in the scene with this orange or yellow blades. So let's bring this to the far side of the frame here and make it higher perhaps. And I can now rotate this back into the scene. Okay, if I jump through my camera again, and by the way, I'm going to make a copy of this camera, and this new camera 1, I can remove the tags, and I'm gonna protect both of these cameras so that I don't move them by accident, because that would knock off the calibration we did before. Okay, so now if I hit play, the balloon strings should be blowing across the scene. Maybe the wind is too weak. We could, just to illustrate how this works, place it at 100, which is too strong. I think I was using about 10 in the original scene, which is gonna be enough for what I want here. I can go to the hair, and in the cache tab, let's cache the whole simulation, so that I can scrub through the timeline and pick a perfect position and use that for the render. Okay, so it takes just about a minute or so, and now I can scrub through my timeline and pick what I think would be a perfect positioning for the strings. Okay, and something like this would be fine. We need a material for the ribbon though, so let's create a simple white material with some reflection. So I'm going to add reflection legacy, take off any specular on that, and the attenuation is going to be additive. It's a plasticky kind of material, and we can maybe lower the reflection just a touch, but it's going to be a shiny white silver kind of ribbon on this. So I can attach this to my sweep Nurbs, and if I play it through again, let's see what we have. Let's just go all the way to the end, and I think I want this kind of position. My cache seems to have disappeared, so I have to just calculate again. So just doing a render of this right now. I want to show you something that's a bit off, and it's the look on the balloons. It's a bit flat right now, and that's because there isn't anything really around in the scene for them to reflect besides you know, this proxy just slightly. You can see it in some areas here, and then also just reflecting themselves. So what I did in the original scene was a bit of a cheat and a workaround. I took a totally different image which I shot separately, so it's on this sky object here. I'm gonna bring this into this project, and what this was another image which I used in a separate frame. So it's the background image to this composite, and I just placed this onto a sky, and that gave me the reflections I wanted, just to make the balloons look a bit more interesting. So if we stop this about here and run another render, you will see this will look much better. Just something for the balloons to reflect and look a bit more interesting. I also added some depth to this, because right now all the balloons are equally sharp throughout the entire frame. There should be some slight blur for the ones close to the camera and the ones far out in the distance. So if I go to my render settings, I want to go to the engine and change this to physical. And the kind of settings I used here was you know, adaptive, set to automatic with a threshold of about 11%, and this gave me a pretty clean render in the end. And then also tick depth of field, and then in our camera we want to go to the physical tab and load up an f-stop value here. Now I know I shot this at 28mm at 3.5 f-stop, which is actually going to be too blurry. The lower this number is, the more blur you have, because if you recall, this camera is actually 43mm instead of 28. So that higher focal length is going to create more blur, which means we have to compensate the f-stop number here. So it should be more like 5. And that's going to give me just some very slight blur, because the original image really was quite sharp throughout anyway, but there would definitely be some blur the further back you went and also closer to the camera. So in the camera settings, in the object tab, we want to drag our plane with the proxy into the focus object. So this is going to set the right focus point, and you won't see much of a difference when I do the render right now, just because of how subtle this is. And with physical, it's going to be a bit slower, but for a final render, there's nothing wrong waiting a few extra minutes to get a better looking image. And you can see now this balloon is just a bit softer looking, and it just adds some slight depth, and the ones in the distance out here are also just starting to blur out just a small amount. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. The reflections look nice, and by the way, if I had the chance to do this again, I would go back to the same location and take a panorama of the scene, and then use that in a sky object for the reflections instead, and that would look even more realistic. But this right here isn't too bad anyway. One last detail before we do the final render is there was some reflections on the floor here in this puddle of water. So if you look at the example, you see just a few of the balloons being reflected here. And the way I did this was, in the top view, I set the display options to grow shading so I could see the textures, and then I drew some geometry over this. So if I go to the pen tool and sketch again, I want to draw over the area where there is some water, so something like this, just a rough sketch of this pool. And I can go back to the perspective view, and if we go all the way back to where that is, I can drop this into an extrude to generate some geometry, and let's set the movement to 0 on everything, so we just have a flat piece of geometry like this. I'm gonna push it up on the Y just by 1 centimeter so it rises out of the ground, and I need to create a transparent material for this, so just set this to black first of all, and transparency with a refraction of about 1.5, which is going to roughly approximate what water does. And that's it. Maybe take off the specular. We just want the reflections from this, and apply this to the extrude object here. And now if I go back into my camera and hit render, I should get some reflection coming from the floor right there. And it seems I missed some geometry actually at the front of this. There should be a bit more geometry going back this way. We'll take a look before we do the final render. But now you see the reflection from the paddle. Now it's reflecting too many things, and there is definitely some missing geometry here. So let's just quickly fix that. That's in the plane. I can go to line mode again, and let's just move these lines outward like this and reveal just a bit more geometry there. And we can go to the spline of our water here and drag that out too. Now to avoid those extra reflections, I think they were coming from the sky object first of all, so let's go to the exclusion tab on this compositing tag and drag the floor or our water geometry here. And I think I also have to go to the tag on the proxy here and do the same thing. And now if I jump back into this, and let's only render this region. Okay, so the reflections are working. It's just another layer to try and sell the overall realism of the scene in total. So for the final render, we need to separate these objects into object buffers and some multi-pass layers. So on the balloons, in the compositing tag, there are 2 buffers, one just in slot number 1 and another in number 3. That's because the spline is going to be number 2 and 3 as well. So 3 carries both the ribbons, which by the way should be here, and the balloons as well in number 3. So when I go to the render settings, under multi-pass we load up 3 object buffers, and I only used one of them in the end, but just in case I wanted to affect the ribbon separately, that's why I had 3 different things in the end. But we just need 1, 2 and 3 here. And then also a shadow pass, so let's get that too. Refraction and reflection, and that's it. Along with the main image, those are the layers I took into Photoshop for some compositing. So let's take multi-pass here and save that as a PNG as well. And you can save this to anywhere you want. So when this is all set, you just go ahead and hit your final render. It might be worth noting that if you do render depth of field into the frame, you will definitely need the buffers, because it's also going to blur the actual frame as well. So the geometry in the scene will get blurred, and then it's like it's getting blurred twice, because it has the original blur from the photo itself, and then you're blurring it again using the physical engine and the f-stop control we have here. So with the object buffers, it means that we are only placing just the balloons over the original image rather than the whole render from Cinema 4D. Okay, so let's go to Photoshop again just to take a look at how everything stacks up in the end. Starting with our original image again, and this is it right here. There is the shadow layer, which is just a black and white map. You set this to multiply and lower the opacity. So I lowered this from 100%, which is this, to about 60 or so. You can see some shadows in the sky. This is where the balloons were, but we overlaid the balloons on top, and that covers that up. And then on top of this is the original cutout, just to cover up everything. And the last thing is the reflection in the water here, which came in just a bit too bright. You can see that the reflection here should be darker than what it's reflecting. So the shoe here just kind of turns to a much darker color, and the sky is also a darker reflection. The balloons here are just too bright. So I can attach a levels adjustment to this, and this is what I use to just lower the overall brightness of the reflection, and that just made it look a bit more realistic. And then I also played around with layer masks just to paint out certain areas which shouldn't have been there. So if I disable the layer mask, you can see that there's too much reflection over here. This would be covered up, so we shouldn't see any balloons in that general area. And then also closer to the edges, I just try to fix that as well. So this was the final result, and that concludes this tutorial. So I hope you guys learned some new things that maybe you didn't know before, and I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. So as usual, thank you very much for watching, and you can subscribe so you make sure that you never miss any new tutorials. And you know, if you have any questions regarding what I talked about in this video or anything else in general, then you can just use the comment section below, and I will do my best to respond. But again, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.